Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to the DM Roundtable for January 2020. This is a chance for patrons and I to get together and discuss topics in tabletop RPGs, and by sharing our ideas, thoughts, and experiences, we can all become better DMs or GMs. The DM Roundtable discussions are open to all patrons at every level of patreon.com/roguewatson. You don't even have to be an active participant. You can jump in here and lurk to your heart's content, and we are glad to have you. Shoutouts to my platinum patrons, Andrew, Richard, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick, Andy, and Grayson, and gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, Yuma, Marcos de Vicente, Gilberto, Sean, A.K., Cert2B, Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Arash, and Lumpy Spuds. Thank you all very much for your support. This month's topic, as determined by the poll on the Patreon page, is all about maps. Do we use maps or not? What kind of map styles do we prefer? Does every battle need a map, and does every map need a battle? Joining me for this month's DM Roundtable, we have Sean, a.k.a. Cert2B.
Good evening.
Good evening. And Andy. Welcome, new patron Andy.
Good evening, everybody.
So, most folks that follow my channel and have heard me talk before probably know my preferences for maps. Obviously, I run all of my D&D campaigns in the last couple of years on Roll20, which that alone is a major factor to not only the answer to the question of do I use maps or not, but what kind of map styles that I prefer. So I guess my first question to kick this off is, let's start with the new person, Andy. Do you primarily play games in Roll20? Or do you primarily play them on a tabletop, and does that color how you use maps or not use maps?
I'd say most of my gaming is tabletop still. I'm a player in one Roll20 game at the moment, and I'm still pretty new to that, but I've been doing it on the table for a long time. And lacking artistic talent basically leaves me either drawing some pretty rundown Dragon Heist-looking maps or... possibly, I've recently watched your video on that, and so I feel your criticism and I share it to a degree. I can't reproduce anything better than that personally.
That's
when
true,
I draw my own. I like a good pre-printed map when I can get it for the table, but the resources are always a limiting factor in that. Well, being able to.
Let me ask you this as a follow-up. Do you prefer to play pre-published campaigns in order to have those map resources already there? Or do you only do kind of homebrew stuff and then you're on your own for maps?
Most of my experience has actually been, we run homebrew stuff, but I filch maps from all over the place. Okay. I mean, I've bought a lot of the pre-published campaigns that come out, and there's only a handful of them I've run straight. Usually I buy them so I can filch maps.
Okay. Sean, you usually play on Roll20, right?
I do a little bit of tabletop. I've got a friend that I work with who he kind of lets us kind of use his house in terms of hosting. And so there's a couple folks that we get together. We don't get together that often, so the vast majority of mine is online. I do have obviously Roll20, but there's the other one I completely
Fantasy Grounds.
Fantasy Grounds.
Yes. The other one.
I actually do have a license for that, but I haven't really had much of a chance to use that. So mostly we do Roll20 because it's actually fairly simple. I mean, it just runs on HTML5, and all you got to do is log into it. Boom, you're ready to go. But in terms of maps, it's kind of the gambit, and it really depends on the situation as well. I know one of the things that you sometimes run into, and obviously there's the criticism that we've all kind of talked about, especially with like those black and white maps. But there's also, I think, a reason for that as well, and it simply is copyright. If you're trying to sell it, especially if you're an independent publisher on, like the DM Guild or, other sites like that, you're kind of limited, because if you use someone's some images or some that's copyrighted to someone else, and then you put it into your published work, you can actually get sued for that. So that's a bit concerning if you're kind of doing it that way. And I think that's why you kind of see a lot of those black and white maps in some of that published material.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. There's one thing about the recent development of Wizards going towards a black and white graph paper style. It has made me appreciate these really gorgeous full color maps from the earlier campaigns even more, to realize that now that we're left with this, I want to transition to this because I have so many thoughts about map art style. And I think you two specifically might be a little older than me in terms of the editions that you've played with, like the era of D&D. Do you have, I guess we'll go back to Andy first, any nostalgia for that top-down, literal graph paper, black and white style, when you see that the new art style, even from Wizards now, for the last, like, I think 3 or 4 main campaign adventures, appear to be kind of emulating that style?
I wouldn't call it a nostalgia per se. I mean, that is basically the old school way of doing things. So at the most, I would say I'm used to it, maybe a nerd to it a little bit, less offended by it. But the modern full color maps that you're talking about, once you get hooked on those, you really feel the loss going back to just having a 1-inch grid that you penciled some random stuff in on, or just put some basic lines on. It looks like a geometry problem instead of an actual map of a living, breathing location.
Yeah.
There is something lost in that. I definitely agree with many of your criticisms there.
Yeah, there's I got a lot of feedback on that one in particular, because that was the one that really hit me, like, oh, what is going on with these maps? And since then, I've since kind of cooled off a bit, to the point where I'm just like, oh, well, I just don't like this, instead of being shocked by it. But a lot of people do like that style. So, Sean, how do you feel about the like black and white graph paper map versus a full color detail?
Oh, give me the full color detail map any day.
Amen.
Any day. Yeah. Because I know you had done the review of the old Pathfinder one of Rise of the Rune Lords. There's actually a bunch of like a listing of maps that a couple artists have done that have really gone far in terms of really detailed, large, multicolored, beautiful looking maps. And it puts a lot of like the just ordinary maps that are out there really to shame.
I've actually seen somebody was linking it to me, maybe it was you, of folks that make maps specifically to replace the ones that Wizards uses. And I don't want to shit too much on the like art style there, because that is definitely a preference thing. But yeah, I'm glad people certainly can provide their own maps, and that we can use them. Shifting gears from map style, which well, let me just say this. I maybe Prince of the Apocalypse just broke me, because Princes of the Apocalypse has gorgeous dungeon maps, like absolutely incredible. It's just, they're fun to look at, they're fun to explore. They may not be the most excitingly designed dungeons, but the actual just pure aesthetic, the fact that they all have their themes towards the elements and they use them in really cool ways. Like, if you're a fan of just cool looking dungeon maps from a top down, just gorgeous perspective, like Prince of the Apocalypse is freaking fantastic. And now I'm realizing that might have broken me towards like any map that I now look at. I am judging it compared to what turns out might be like the peak maps. Although I do like Tomb of Annihilation maps quite a bit. That was a big reason why I decided to do Tomb of Annihilation. In fact, to springboard off that to another map discussion, that might be a big reason why we chose to do Tomb of Annihilation for our next campaign, because it had really good maps that were all ready to go. all I had to do was supply like random battle maps. We already had like cool world maps for Omu and Fort Schultz, and then we had some really good location battle maps for, I don't know what, 12.5 locations, like absolutely incredible. So maps, I think, ends up meaning a lot to me and my group, because and a big part of that is because we play on Roll20. So we use those visual aids probably a lot more than you would in the tabletop space, but I would suspect that map design alone, not alone, but was a major factor in choosing our next campaign. And unfortunately, might not be a factor in choosing our next campaign after this one, because there hasn't been any new published adventures from Wizards that have actually done a map style that I like. So I'm looking at all these new adventures going, well, I'm going to have to do something about these maps for all these new adventures that are coming out. Go ahead, Andy.
I will say from a personal perspective that you were asking about nostalgia for old school, and that I don't have any personal attachment to it from the combat perspective. But one of the places where I really appreciate the detailed maps, you were mentioning Tomb of Annihilation. One of my favorite maps in there is the map of Port Nine Zaru. It's just it's just fascinating and gorgeous to look at. And those sorts of larger scale place maps really help you excuse me, they really help you put together an image in your mind of what these locales look like, and kind of situate sometimes even just the theme of them a lot more than just a dot or a bunch of circles or what have you.
Yeah, for sure. That's something that I have noticed that Wizards does tend to at least produce in all of these books, is they have like one good region map. Like Descent into Avernus had one good map of Avernus, I guess. Although it even lists like, hey, don't trust these actual geography because it's hell and it changes. Like Saltmarsh had a good like town map for the town of Saltmarsh. Like they do produce decent region maps. But yeah, Tomb of Annihilation had an amazing Port Nine Zaru map of a region map, an amazing Chult map, I think, for the entire jungle crawl, and an amazing map for Omu, which was also basically a region map, which is a good thing to bring up. Like, maps don't necessarily have to be literal battle grids. They could be just, I always called them like overland maps, to use like a video game term. But and I think I used it a little bit in Princes. They had like some valley, and I literally treated it like an RPG where you would walk. And what I did is I created little, there'd be like a little hex token to represent the party, and it'd be like, all right, you are here. Like the closest thing to like a abstract version of a miniature of the party, and now you can travel over here, and then when we get to here, now we enter like another battle map. I really like good region maps too, and I think they need to be good because you end up looking at that region map far longer for multiple sessions than you would any individual battle map. I mean, we were in Port Nine Zaru for what, 4 or 5 sessions, and we've been in Omu for I think 7 or 8 sessions. So those maps need to be damn good if you're going to end up hanging around them for very long.
And that Chult hex map carried a lot of weight for y'all too, across the whole the whole hex crawl.
Yeah, that's a major part of that campaign, is doing a hex crawl, and that would not have been. And that was a cool thing that Roll20 did too, was the fact that it was interactive and you could delete the hexes and literally do a hex crawl, which was pretty neat. But yeah, that one had really, really good region maps. And Princes had a good good region map for, what was it called, the Desarin Valley. Yeah, we were staring at that map for a long time, and I think those region maps are really good.
Yeah, I use region maps a lot in my campaigns too. I actually have a token that I've uploaded to my Roll20. It's literally a "you are here" with an arrow pointing down.
Do you make any of your own region maps for any homebrews, or do you find? And it doesn't have to be region map. This could be, I guess, any kind of maps. But do you make any maps, or do you like to find maps and then utilize those maps in your own campaign or a campaign that you're running?
Well, me personally, it's a bit of both. I mentioned not having artistic talent. A couple of years ago, I did shell out some money for a map creator program called Campaign Cartographer. And it makes some pretty good maps that I can handle for local regional stuff to kind of give them a general layout of the area that they're exploring.
Can you give us like a kind of a brief summary of campaign cartographer?
It's a lot like it's a lot like other things where you can download. It comes with a bunch of preset tokens that you can use to represent cities. There's well, as a matter of fact, you were talking about styles. I'm a big fan of Mike Schle's work, and there's actually a whole Mike Schle pack you can buy for it.
Okay.
That contains some stuff that he's done, and you just kind of maneuver like little town icons here, different sets of forest here. You place little individual trees or draw an area and fill it in with a forest texture.
And then you can upload that.
I sound like I'm plugging them at this point, but that's
well, no, I'm interested in it. Yeah. Do you then upload that image, or do you print it off, I guess, to use?
Like I said, I haven't used it for anything online since that's a newer arena for me.
Okay.
In my home campaigns, yeah, I would go, and in times when I'm feeling particularly generous, I'll send off to Kinko's and have them put it on a poster. But you know that's for something I'm particularly proud of. Just little regional maps, things. I'll just print them off at home and bring it to the table just to kind of show them where they are. Sketch that way I can save a copy of it, and if I want to sketch on it or draw a little path maps to show where they've been or something on it, I can go print another one if I need a clean one.
Okay. Sean, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I mainly use like kind of already existing maps, just pulling from various different resources, but I have created a few of my own. I haven't really done any like regional maps. Mostly have been very like localized one. The site that I typically use for that is called Dungeon Fog. It's just dungeonfog.com. And it's a very simple, straightforward way of putting maps together. There's essentially like 3 tiers with it. There's the free one, which has limited assets, and I think you can only like save 1 or 2 maps with that. Then there's one that's like $50 a month, or $50 a year, I should say. That basically gives you access to all of their assets, and you can create and save as many maps as you want to. The third tier is like $100 for the year, and it's the same one as the second one, but they actually let you use their resources and assets with a little legal blurb that you can actually sell the maps that you create using their software. So it's just a nice, neat little thing.
I was going to ask about that. I know that especially with the rise of pay-to-play DMing on Roll20 and stuff, that introduces legal issues with copyright that everybody has to be careful about.
Or if you were making like a DM's Guild product or something, then you could make a map in there and then include it in your product, maybe as a, hey, this is a map that goes to this dungeon kind of a thing. I could see that being a thing you could do.
And I've also seen some maps that people have put together using the Dungeon Fog program, and they are absolutely gorgeous. Some of the ones I've seen.
Nice. I honestly haven't looked at doing that stuff. I have, to kind of echo what Andy said, very little artistic talent. I have to basically just rip stuff, combine things that other people have done to try to make a map that works. I've never even come close to trying to do and part of the reason why I think I'm intimidated about even doing a homebrew campaign, even if I have like story stuff that I want to explore, I just don't have the time or talent for crafting maps around that. So it would have to be a question of, okay, I need to just find maps or purchase them that will work for me and then have to build around that. One question I want to ask is, have you ever, obviously you can have a need for a map and find that map. Has there ever been a case where you have found a map and then just liked that particular map so much, you're like, oh, I need to build an encounter out of this, or I need to, I need to just have a dungeon that is this map because I just like this map so much. Has a map ever inspired you to actually create a story or dungeon or whatever else to go with it.
Most definitely. I've had a couple where I've run into like that. There was one I was just kind of looking for, like just a sort of a graveyard type encounter, and someone had put a map where it was like these little tombs that were kind of in these areas, and they had done a lot of detail where there were like broken doors on the ground, and then there was a couple bodies here or there, and there's blood stain that they put there and a streak here or there. It was just really well designed, and is one of those ones where you just look at it and it's like, oh, I could do something with this.
Nice. I was trying to think. Andy, do you have anything like that while I try to search my notes? I asked a question. I don't even know if I have an answer.
Oh, definitely. Like I mentioned it earlier, I've rated a lot of published materials for that sort of stuff, but probably the one that jumps out at me the most. I don't know. I don't know if you were playing much then, but in the early 2000s, when third edition was newer and they were coming out with the pre-painted D&D miniatures line, they tried to get D&D miniatures up as an ongoing wargaming thing again, and they were releasing combat encounter maps for that system.
I mean, wasn't that a big push of fourth edition also? Were they trying to go in that direction?
They did, and they altered the rules, but the mini wargaming thing fell off a bit in popularity at that point.
Yeah.
Or at least the one connected with Wizards.
I'm going to go off on a tangent for a second. They bought out HeroScape, and HeroScape was an amazing board game with very easy to use miniatures. Not even a board; it was a tabletop war game that was it was the rule of cool. It was like ninjas and cyborgs and demons and necromancers and aliens and robots and just everything you could be. And it was a hex grid, had these real chunky tile pieces, and it was so cool for it was available for years in the early 2000s. And then Wizards bought it out. I guess Hasbro had, I forget what the exact thing was, but they turned it into D&D. They tried to, when it was not selling as well after 4 waves or whatever, fucking Wizards bought it out. I think exactly the time you were talking about, where they were trying to make minis happen, and then it really didn't happen, and so they ended up killing HeroScape, and I'm so pissed about that because HeroScape was great. All right, that's my tangent. Please continue.
No, all I was going to say was, just to go back to your original question, there was a battle map that was released for one of their tournaments for miniatures, but as soon as I saw it and I saw somebody playing a combat encounter on it, it was a map. It was just the interior of a temple building. It was covered up with teleporters that you could just zip around to different places during this kind of sprawling combat. And I was like, I have to use that. And so I completely rejiggered something that had been going on in one of my homebrew campaigns so that I could introduce a combat encounter where people just zipped all over the map back and forth in various turns with all the little teleporters.
Nice, that's cool. I think that's really neat too when maps can are so well done and so detailed that you're like, oh wow, I can just even if they don't come with their own adventure or dungeon notes or anything, you can just look at it and be like, oh, I know exactly how I'd run this. That would be a really neat contest, I think, to give to a bunch of DMs. Actually, just give them a Mike Schley style map that's fully detailed and be like, hey, write this dungeon, and then see. And I bet you'd get however 6 or 7, however many people you had, all completely different dungeon designs, even though it's the same art right there. I think that's a really cool idea.
I know that you were mentioning earlier thoughts on lessons from earlier editions, and I know especially. I mean, not that people in older editions didn't use maps; they used it a lot. But I know a lot of people who play very adamantly in Theater of the Mind, for their combat stuff, and I can do that sometimes. It's worthwhile sometimes if there's nothing significantly interesting going on. One of the things that maps adds the most, though, if you've got some sort of really interesting environmental challenge going on during a combat. Some either an interesting layout or some sort of magic effect, lava, something, anything like that. Positioning becomes really important, and that's when a map will really save your bacon.
And whenever you have a rogue or two, or in your case, Eric, an entire party of rogues, that type of thing can even come into play even more.
That's true. They're always moving around, and that's part of their character strength, is to be able to reposition and constantly move around. And that I definitely get the theater of the mind thing quite a bit. Like that's, obviously the original way to play D&D. I only played D&D a handful of times growing
I'll
up,
push back on
but
that a little bit, because
okay.
you talk about the original way to play. D&D grew out of chainmail, which was a miniatures
A
war
miniature,
gaming.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, they did have maps from the beginning. There was a whole press kind of at the end of first edition, the very beginning of second edition, where the maps kind of and minis kind of fell out of favor. But
Interesting.
they really picked it back up, especially with fourth edition.
Yeah, that was the big push. I just remember when I played it, it was in high school. Third edition had just come out. That's specifically dating myself. And my DM was one of those like, oh, we're not playing third. That was new. We're going to play second. That's the real D&D. And we had no maps whatsoever. It was all theater of the mind stuff, which was fine. I mean, and that to me was how you played D&D. And I was like, all right, this is fun. I'm going to go back to playing Neverwinter Nights now because video games are cool. And I think that's why I gravitated toward things like Roll20. Obviously, it's the way I can play because all my friends are far apart for the most part. But having those visual aids and having the maps especially, it's a useful touchstone also for a lot of people that maybe don't normally play D&D and aren't necessarily like the theater kids or not to be disparaging towards theater kids or to non-people that don't think necessarily super creatively. But it is very useful to have those visual aids there, and not just for positioning, but just to like get into the game too. Just being able to look at some kind of visualization of your character and the enemies and all of that, whether that is minis on a poster board or digital tokens on the computer screen. I've managed to look through my notes for Tomb of Annihilation. I don't know if I've ever actually used a map just because I liked it. I think Tomb actually has had a lot of good maps already, and the only ones that I've had to use custom were maps that I needed for a specific purpose. Like I needed a specific map for Mabala. I needed a specific map for the King of Feathers fight. I think the closest one I can think of for an example is Gillian's personal quest, the Dangwaru Typhoon Palace dungeon, which I guess maybe that counts as one that I looked at and being like, oh, yeah, I definitely want to include this in my campaign. But on the other hand, it was also an area that was built for Chult. So as kind of like a DLC almost expansion. But that's the closest one I have where I looked at that dungeon going, yeah, I want that in my campaign. But I ran it as pretty close to as written. I modified some stuff in it, but I didn't change too much. And I don't have my notes for older campaigns, unfortunately, but I don't think I added too much custom stuff in that one. But I certainly would. Like that would be a neat thing. And I have a folder. I'll say this right here. I have a directory, D&D/maps on my PC. That is just me going through like, what is it? Pinterest and Imager and Reddit and just fucking saving cool maps that I like. Just going through and like, oh, that's a cool map. I'm saving that. That's a cool map. I'm saving that. Oh, I know one. The very beginning of the campaign, when they were on the boat going to Chult, and there was that Harpy shipwreck encounter. That was an example of a map that I saw, and I was like, this is a really cool looking map, and I want my players to be on a boat going to Chult. I'm going to use this encounter. And that was an example where I just saw a map and I wrote an encounter based on that map. So there you go. I have a specific anecdote. And to where several people have asked me through comments or direct emails, wherever else people contact me, like where I got that map, because that was very much a cool, fun map. And obviously more people watched the beginning of the campaign than the end of it. So I think a lot of people are seeing that map and going like, oh man, that's a cool map. And it is a cool map. But yeah, I have a huge folder of maps.
Just a very quick tangent. I did want to offer you some quick praise on the way you started Tomb of Annihilation. You started it different than most people I've seen start it. The beginning of the opening of that was just fantastic, and I think it's much better than the way it's written.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I've talked about that a lot on like the crafting annihilations for the beginning and all that. But yeah, that does go off on a little bit of a tangent for Tomb, but I definitely did want to change things up. Wizards has never intros have never been their strong suit from what I can tell from all their published adventures. most of the adventure
Agreed.
hooks are bad. Just you're in a bar or you're guards in a wagon train. Like, come on, guys, do something better than that. And part of the difficulty, I think, in making intros matter is you need to tie your characters into it. And to Wizards' defense, they don't know what everybody's playing, so that's kind of on the DMs, I guess, to create that. But on the other hand, like, it's a lot of extra work because no, I'm not gonna fucking just teleport you to Schult. That's lame. You gotta get there and have adventures along the way because that's what it's all about.
And it gives you an excuse to use Harpy shipwreck maps.
It does. I had to create harpies because there's no harpies in Tomb Annihilation. I had to move them in there. That was neat. What else can we talk about for maps? What haven't we covered about maps? I don't. I feel like there should be more we can talk about. How do you deal with?
Here's a question,
Yeah.
and I don't want to dip too deep into spoiler territory. I don't know if this is a no players allowed thing like crafting, but have you ever dealt with before with any situations where you had a map for an encounter, but the map included pieces of a dungeon or something else that could independently move? And if so, how did you handle it? And was that a pain?
Okay, I think I know what you're referring. No, I haven't dealt with that yet. That's a unique situation I've seen in Tomb Annihilation, which is really cool.
Yeah, it is cool because I've run that at a table before, and it's a pain in the butt, even if it's cool. But
just because the physical part, yeah. I will. We'll get to that when we do a future episode of Crafting Annihilation. I think it'll be the more appropriate place for it. But I have not run into that yet. That's a unique quality that Roll20 has just started doing, which is maps, and they've done this a couple times when they have like secret passages or things. They'll actually put like I forget how they do it. They put one part on the GM layer and one part on the token layer, so that you can literally, when the players see it, they will see. And this is a unique problem with digital compared to physical, obviously, because physical, I'm putting the map together or whatever. With digital, I have to be very careful that the layers are right, and that even if there's a secret door, it has to look like it's not a secret door. And a lot of times when designers draw maps, they have like a line and like a squiggly S on it or something. I'm like, well, that's not going to fucking work. You got to look like, a wall, like the rest of the dungeon. And then I need to tell the players, when they find a secret door or something. And obviously I need to know, but the players can't know. So that's something I have to be very aware of. I believe somebody even caught it in one of the Crafting Annihilations about, hey, make sure the dynamic lighting is on there right, because Roll20 missed a dynamic lighting one point at a secret door in a shrine. So I had to make sure that was all correct. And we've run into a few problems like that, where I just have to make sure I always check each individual layer and make sure it's all looking correct, because there are some maps that you have to be very careful about in terms of what can the players see and not see, because you could run into some kind of annoying spoiler territory in terms of how dynamic lighting works and all that. I was going to ask about, for those of you that run physical maps, how do you deal with like fog of war type stuff? Do you just your player just sees the whole map and then you just put minis on there as they see monsters?
My preferred method, being as old school as I am, is I have a series of black squares of cloth that I cover up parts of the map that they haven't explored yet.
I like that. Literal like fog of war right there.
Yeah, I've also seen it where, in terms of the physical maps, where they kind of lay it out almost Gloomhaven style, where you get to see the different rooms, but nothing's populated until you open up the door or enter that room. I've seen it done that way too.
Also, you can use tiles to you would kind of you have a full picture map behind your DM screen, but you can put the map in individual tiles, and you just place the tiles down as they go and explore various areas. That's another way I've seen it done.
Okay. That's fascinating to me because obviously I'm used to doing, we started out doing the basic Fog of War with Roll20, which is serviceable, but then once we went dynamic lighting, like, holy crap, that is a game changer. That's just a really sexy tool that instantly, I think, improves the game and makes it look really nice. I haven't been able to.
And that's
go ahead.
As I say, that's the reason I wanted to ask you about dynamic maps, is because, going back to old school ways of doing things, that's always been one of the big limitations, is anything that can dynamically change about the environment is hard to represent in person on a static map. And it's one of the things that makes digital play so exciting, is it, with a computer program, it's much easier to do that stuff.
That's true. Yeah. If you had something where like this bridge is going to collapse like halfway in this combat encounter, like, how do you do that? I hopefully we're getting to that point. I'm starting to see the early versions of that with some of these Roll20 things, and Tomb was a good example where there are, that one thing in the dungeon that's got moving parts, and some like hidden doors are used for multiple layers, like that kind of thing. That stuff is really exciting. I would like to see more of that. More, you could probably do it with multiple layers would be the easiest thing. The problem I run into is that dynamic lighting is on a different layer. So if things change, the dynamic lighting does not automatically change with it. You have to manually change the dynamic lighting situation, which that's a pain in the butt. And if you get a pre-purchased map on Roll20, a lot of times they draw that the dynamic lighting in like one giant borderline, to where if you like try to delete any section of it, you'll delete all the dynamic lighting on the map. And I think there was at least one or two cases where I had to go through a map early and delete the dynamic lighting and then redo it in chunks, because I knew I wanted to be able to delete certain chunks off of it. Or in a situation where something that Roll20 still struggles with is trying to do multiple elevation, which granted is a nightmare in a top-down map anyway. But the way that it kind of can do it is by drawing dynamic lighting around like, taller buildings and things. The problem is there's no way in Roll20, at least, to program it to say, hey, do dynamic lighting on this side, but not this side. In other words, if you've got a cliff on one side, I can't look up and see that what's on top of that cliff. But if I'm on top of the cliff, I should be able to look down. And currently, the only thing you can do in Roll20 is just say, is this a sight blocker or not? So that's the kind of thing I've run into, and it makes some of those, if you have like ramparts on your map that people can walk on, it gets really annoying, and to the point where it almost drags that session down, because I've run into this too, where I'm constantly having to tell the players, okay, here's what the situation is. And a lot of times once somebody makes it to the top of the rampart, I end up just deleting like the dynamic lighting there, because I'm like, all right, well, you're up there, and we'll just have to say the ones down there don't, you guys can't see, but now you're up there, you can see. It just gets really annoying, and there's not.
Yeah, you ran into that with the Man and Crocodile Temple.
Okay. I know. I've run into it several times, but that's good that we have a specific anecdote, but it's a bummer. And there doesn't appear to be a solution at the moment. I hope that's something that we can get, because I do think that's a really exciting thing, is to be able to create dynamic maps that change, but also just give me the ability to do like those minor elevation changes that incorporate the line of sight. That would be really, really helpful, because that is a bit of a nightmare.
There are two for you.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Jordan. Welcome to the Maps Chat.
What up, guys?
Glad to have you.
With the Roll20, because Eric and I have gone back and forth about Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds off air, off stream. With Roll20, I know that you've done it when you were preparing for the most recent temple encounters in Omu, where you would check the lighting in the temple when it was hidden behind behind the bat statue.
Yeah.
So you had to create just the door, and you would slide the door on the map layer out of the way so it would change the lighting. is there a way to, with those multiple elevation changes, to basically create a door, but instead of moving it out of the way, move it to a different layer? That way it's no longer on the main layer. Like, is there multiple layers on the dynamic layers? Or is it one layer for all dynamic lighting?
As far as I'm aware, and people correct me on Roll20 all the time, so I can definitely stand corrected. But as far as I'm aware, there's only the dynamic lighting layer. Like there's the map layer, there's the token layer, there's the GM layer, and then there's the dynamic lighting layer. And dynamic lighting only works if lines are drawn on that layer. So the only way, as far as I know, to manipulate it is to either have a line or not have a line.
And how easy for Roll20 is it to actually do those lines? Because in the Fantasy Grounds world, where they're getting ready to send out Unity, and Unity is partnering with them to create dynamic lighting for their Fantasy Grounds maps, for them, you can literally, almost like you're doing paint, draw a couple of lines, and those lines then become dynamic lighting. So they can make it very, very, very quick and easy. I just didn't know on the Roll20 how complicated it is to add, manipulate, and move. Because from when you were talking about it, it sounded like it's an art form.
I mean, it's basically the same thing. Like, it's like drawing lines in paint. It's just that it can be a pain in the butt, and it's not something I enjoy doing. And I don't particularly even try to do a beautiful job of it. I pretty much just do a very sloppy like outline of whatever area that I'm in just to get the job done. But what I've learned is whenever I have like, say like a map full of trees, and I'm like, all right, well, I'm not going to fucking draw circles around every single tree here. I'm going to pick like 5 big trees, and those are going to be the sight blockers, that kind of a thing.
Right.
It's not that big of a deal. And I'll say when I ran Princes of the Apocalypse, that was before Roll20 had official licensed modules that they sold that you could buy and have all that shit ready to go. I had to manually put together all of the Roll20 maps. I bought the map pack from the 2 artists who did Princes and imported those into Roll20 and did all of the dynamic lighting for all of those maps. So I'm very acutely aware of how to do all those maps. And even then, like, it's kind of a pain, but it's not really that bad.
I feel you though, because I recently before the Essentials kit came out on Fantasy Grounds Marketplace, I already bought it because I knew that I was going to take the Essentials kit and the starter kit and combine them and create one campaign where you would have the starter kit where it was more straight storyline, and the Essentials kit where it was more open world, and combine them to create more of a video game feel for a bunch of newer players. But that means I had to take the actual maps, take pictures of them, put them up there, add the layers, add the fog of war, add and do the grid, the whole 9 yards. So yeah, it's a pain in the butt, but once you get it up and running, like honestly, I think my maps are working better than the ones on the marketplace.
Yeah,
because I had to figure out how to do adding all the different. This is where the things drop, all the tokens. These are where these are positioned.
For Roll20 specifically, the thing that drives me absolutely bananas is when I'm trying to use a map that already has a grid on it, and I'm trying to import a grid map into Roll20, which Roll20 already has their grid. And now they have a system where you can try to like align them to the grid by drawing like a 3x3
box.
box.
Yeah.
And that gets pretty close. But I think they added that at some point, because I remember it used to be I would just fucking pull my hair out over trying to line those little, and you'd have it like lined up on one side of the map, and you give it to the other side of the map, it's just completely jacked up, and it's like, what am I doing? I don't want to do this right now.
There have been a couple of times in Roll20 where I've ran into that situation, because you can actually go into the map and turn the grid off.
Yeah.
And it basically lets them kind of move around freely, but still letting the players kind of use the grid of the map itself as their 5-foot squares.
That's true.
So I've done that.
I should have just done that at some point with some of these maps.
But yeah. There was something else I was going to mention, because I know that he had mentioned the Unity program. for Fantasy Grounds. One of the neat things that they're also doing with that Unity program is it was something that I was looking at some of the features of it. You can actually put like different blocking layers on them. So like you could see past the first layer, but not the second layer. So if you're kind of drawing around, say, like a rock face, like a collapsed rocky area that players could climb up on. If they're on one side, they can see to the rock layer, but not beyond. If they're on the rock layer, which is in between the two, they can see on both sides. And then if they're all the way the other, they can only see to the rock layer. So that's something else that they were doing. But one of the things that I've actually run into with the campaign that I'm currently on is I have to be careful in terms of putting my dynamic lighting too much on the map, because one of my players, I've mentioned this in a couple other roundtables, is one of my players is playing a Warforged Barbarian, and he has a habit of wanting to make his own doors by Kool-Aid Manning through a door or through a wall. And I can't, if there's too much dynamic lighting, if I were to take it off of there, it would take it off of like half of the map. So I kind of have to be careful with that. And then if there's a few places where I think he may do that, I will just use Fog of War, not the dynamic lighting.
I specifically ran into this situation. Now that you brought that up, during the Frost Giant fight in the entrance of Omu, I had one of the giants like throw a giant rock or something that destroyed a part of the wall. And that's part of what we were talking about earlier with the dynamic maps that can kind of change. And I had part of the wall collapse. But to do that, I wanted to be able to destroy parts of the dynamic lighting. And I think I had to go in and very quickly delete like a good chunk of the dynamic lighting and then quickly redraw it, but leave that part open. So there definitely is an advantage to doing your dynamic lighting in smaller chunks just for that purpose. But that would be a nightmare if I had somebody that could literally destroy any wall. I'd be like, look, you can't. There's invisible force fields around a lot of these areas. It's just a pain in the butt for you to make openings.
And I've kind of had to just make adjustments for that because he's done that because I basically did a conversion from Pathfinder to 5th edition with a campaign that I'm running, which is in 6 parts because that's just how Paizo does their campaigns. Every single part, he has Kool-Aid Manned his way through a wall. So I've just kind of gotten as like, okay, he's probably going to do that here. He's probably going to do that here. I've made accommodations accordingly.
That's what you do. You kind of have to adapt with the players.
The only time
Most of DMing is prep work. Maps are no different.
Very true. Have you guys used the new one where they had like I saw you've been doing it a lot with the Druid with Theron when he B-shapes, but have you guys started using that same functionality with like vehicles like they were talking about with any of the Greyhawk stuff with the nautical boats and everything, how the boats are a map but then they'll change between the layers on the ship?
Yeah, I saw that with when they do that with Ghost of Saltmarsh, I think.
Yeah, that's the one I was trying to think of the name. Yeah. Ghost of Saltmarsh.
So that was an example, and I think I talked about this in the review, that when you change the map, the dynamic lighting I don't think changed. So I think that was the example of that one, or there was some issue like that where it was like, okay, this is a neat idea, but we're not quite there yet in terms of the features.
Right.
The solution
they have to tie it to the actual token.
Yeah, because what we ended up using for Tomb of Annihilation when we were on the boat is the and I think it's that one ship map that comes in the like Dungeon Master's Guide. It's a very basic ship, but it's got the top half of the ship and then the below deck, and they're just 2 separate maps, but they're side by side on the same map. So there's just like a dividing line in between, and that seemed to work okay. Like I never ran into big we used that map a couple times during our little sea adventure section of the campaign, and in terms of people going back and forth and going between those 2 maps, I think it was fine. I think switching between layers might have actually been more of a nightmare than it would have been just having those 2 different maps side by side and just either deleting and copying tokens or just dragging tokens over to say, okay, well, you're on this bottom side now. I think think that ended up working okay. But yeah, the vehicle thing is interesting. That could also lead to some interesting issues of the map itself is static, and then you add other things onto that map as the players actually travel.
To kind of treat it almost like Curse of Strahd, how in that campaign book they show the different layers of the castle. Is that what you mean by when they travel?
I don't know what you mean by the...
Like, if you think of Curse of Strahd and you think of them, have you looked at the campaign module for Curse of Strahd?
I have.
And with it, you remember how when you actually get into Ravenloft or whatever the castle name is, it's more isometric in terms of its design. So if you, similar to how as you're dealing with multiple players on different levels of a ship, having multiple tokens or NPCs or PCs going through the castle on different levels of the castle.
Yeah, that's an extreme version because there's a lot of levels to that castle.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, I mean, we all hope that our players stay together, basically, or at least decently stay together, because that I know that I only recently discovered, maybe not super recently, on Roll20 that you can actually drag people to individual maps, which was, I forget when we figured that out. It might have actually been the last campaign, Storm Kings, but that was actually astonishing. I didn't even know you could do that. You could split up players between different maps, so that would be one solution, but switching between entire map layers during one sequence would be
a nightmare.
Yeah, it would not be very great. And I think a lot of players generally want to stick together. Like, there's very fun shenanigans when you split the party for sure, but even when you split the party, you're usually still on like one map. You know, you'll split it like, I'm going to go in the front, I'll go in the back, that kind of a thing. If you're like doing a warehouse dungeon, I wouldn't think it would happen too often. Where like, I'm going to go down to level 2 of the dungeon, I'm going to go in this room over here. It's like, are you guys trying to get yourselves killed? Like, what is the point of that? So
the only time I've seen anyone actually do that well is actually Tabletop Simulator. Because I remember, I think it was Sean or somebody else was talking about Gloomhaven in your Patreon chat about how you guys were making Gloomhaven on Tabletop Simulator.
Yeah, we play it on there.
They actually have the whole starter kit, all of Phandalin up in there. So as you're going through the story, you can actually get into the thug lair, and as you're in it, there's multiple levels where the Nothic is down in the actual channel below. And so because it's 3-dimensional, it is actual Fog of War, and it's actually, as you're picking your tokens up, it's like you're legitimately someone has created a 3D model of the map.
I did not know that. That's really cool. I didn't know they actually made 3D maps.
Yep, and they will even animate the tokens. So if the NPC or the monster dies, it'll fall over and lay down. If you want it to run, when you click and move it to a different place, as a little running animation.
I mean, you know, what we really want here is a goddamn video game that is just
VR.
I mean, it's a video game program, but just with D&D tools. Like, I don't know why we don't have that yet. I think that is the most obvious thing ever to do. I mean, Neverwinter Nights was close to that, but not quite that. And then they've never tried to replicate like we're going to actually create a 3D video game program that you can build. You know, it's a level editor, it's level editing software, it's campaign editing software. It's got everything that you would need from like Roll20 or Fantasy Grounds, plus 3D models and your avatars in the game. Like, fuck, this just sounds incredible. Like, why don't we have that yet? You know, there's no game without DM and players. So it's very much like a, you know, tabletop simulator kind of thing where it's like everybody has to get on there in order to do the things. But like, you've got all the scripting tools, you've got all the map making tools. Like, God, that would be.
How far did Divinity Original Sin get onto that? Because I only barely started picking up DOS 2.
Yeah.
And I thought that it had some sort of GM equivalent.
Yeah, I mean, there has been They did a thing. Yeah, they did a thing where you could make your own levels, and there was a player who could be the GM and could force like skill checks and stuff. I never got into it very far. That it seemed like it'd be a cool idea. I think Divinity Original Sin 2 is a fantastic game, one of the best RPGs the last couple of years. And in fact, to go off on a tangent, I'm really excited about them doing Baldur's Gate 3 because I love their combat system. I think it works really well. I think their, viewpoint, everything, all that works really well. But that's kind of what I'm talking about. I would love to see with the D&D license, give me. I was even picturing like a 3D engine, but hell, give me that that isometric gameplay standpoint, and probably more people be comfortable with that anyway. For a lot of D&D is table top down anyway. But that would be incredible. DOS I don't think it never took off for whatever reason. I think, people bought it because the campaign is like 90 hours long. And then after that, it's like, I don't actually need more of this game at this point. That's plenty good. I would love to see an editor that was similar to that but it was just the editor. It wasn't like, don't even do Neverwinter Nights. Don't even give me a single player campaign and bundle that. Just give me the editing software with all the tools, the scripting, the assets. Give me, all the assets that Neverwinter Nights had, the walls and the floors and the traps and the monsters and the skyboxes, the, cool like character customization stuff, magic items. Just give me all that and just make it a sandbox that DMs can create their own stuff in, and then they can release, official modules people can play for paid DLC. This is a great idea, Wizards. I hope you're listening, because goddamn, I would buy that in a heartbeat. That would be absolutely amazing.
They had plans to do that.
Dude, Andy, your mic is all kinds of fucked up. Hang on, I gotta stop you. Yeah, that was your mic was super garbled. Try it again. See if we'll come back. I don't know what was going on there.
Any better now?
There we go. That was better. Yeah, you were sounding like a robot underwater.
That was it. I thought I remembered hearing something that they were trying to do exactly what you said in 4th edition, and it just never materialized. Wasn't there a big promise of something like that?
Maybe.
Yeah, that was kind of the game plan. That was the reason why the combat was so detailed, was for that very reason. I just don't know whatever happened with the Fallout and making the actual virtual side.
That's a good question. I never paid attention to D&D in 4th edition, but the last one I know, they tried to do a game called Sword Coast Legends that attempted to have like that kind of a mode in it, but that game was not great, so it didn't end up working at all. Last final thoughts about maps. Sean, do you like maps? That's fine.
Yes, me like map.
Yes, we like
maps. I know the main difference between using maps and not using maps is whether you're going to do theater of the mind or not. And really, that just depends on the GM. Some GMs are really, really good at kind of describing the situation, and you can really picture it in your mind. And some just need the map a little bit more. And I think, like what was mentioned before, especially if you've kind of got newer players that are used to more of a video game type of feel, that can make for a much easier transition if you're using some sort of tactical map.
For sure. Andy, final thoughts about using maps?
I really like using maps. I think the biggest upshot to map is getting everyone visually on the same page. That just really helps bring a story and a scene together. And, the art is very helpful for creating immersion, like you mentioned at the beginning. And in general, I think it's something that's worth putting some time into.
Jordan, thoughts about maps?
Creativity works best when it has constraints, and a map gives you something to build a framework on. So whether you're talking about a world map so you can orient yourself, or whether it's a combat map, or even just a town so they can figure out kind of the general feel or layout of, is this a city or a small merchant village or a logging camp or what? Just a little piece, doesn't matter whether it's hex, grid, ISO, some pictures, any pictures. I've heard your reviews on material that you review from the DM's guide and all that kind of stuff, and I 100% agree with you that maps make and break kind of an experience, especially on virtual, but even the same with theater of the mind. You can be sitting there talking as a GM, and you might have described something, and the players say something completely different because they imagined it differently. So having some form of constraint helps orient everybody. So I think they're really good. I suck at making them, but I'm great at stealing them.
Yeah, shout out to all the amazing map makers out there, because you help make D&D and tabletop RPGs in general a better place to play in. And maps serve as an awesome inspiration for storytelling, as well as providing a fun aesthetic for everyone to immerse themselves in and enjoy. I know that I have been inspired by a lot of maps I've seen. I've also learned restraint, though, when it comes to even if I'm really excited to do a map, maybe not show the map yet, because you show a battle map and players think it's battle time. So I think it's it's important about when to use maps and when not to use them. But in general, maps are awesome. Maps are good. Keep giving us amazing maps, and we'll keep using those maps. All right, thank you all for joining me, Sean, Andy, Jordan, for this month's DM Roundtable. I am Eric. Hope to see you all again for next month's DM Roundtable discussion.